Okay, so to recap all that I've talked about, I don't like that marker, I like this marker. To recap, all of existence is made of matter. It is the material with which God must work through in order to create. He's like a sculptor working with clay. He's like a musician who's having to work with notes. He's like a painter who has to work with the oils or the watercolors or whatever. Every creator has a medium through which their vision is actualized. So even though God's plan is rational, it's good, it's directed towards a common good, and this telos determines spontaneous action within the material world towards a good purpose, towards diversity, towards richness, towards flourishing. You got to look at the material that God's working with here. It's not exactly perfect, and evil can slip in. God recognizes this, and even with this corrupted material, he can still use that to serve his common good, his divine essence. And if we learn how to interpret good from evil in action in this world of confusion where evil can take the shape of goodness, then we can use these evil instances as tests to strengthen our spirit, to make sure it's ready to receive heaven and all its glory. We have to earn it. So God sees that the world is corrupted. However, he's still going to be able to use that to his divine purpose anyways, and allows for evil to act as a way to test our spirits to make sure that we can handle heaven. It's a lot to handle, I guess. I don't know. So anyways, Aquinas has a system which will strengthen our minds and make sure that the relationship between speculative reason, which understands logic, which understands the natural law and order, which underlies all movement and action and being in this world in terms of that common good. Speculative reason understands the truth, it understands essence, it understands logic, generalities, those categorical deductions, apodictic truth that we talked about in the logic quizzes. Speculative reason understands that, but we want to make sure that its relationship with practical reason, that part of our minds which determines our actions from afar, that is, in a spiritual way, like an unmoved mover. We want to make sure that our faculty of practical reason represents that truth and logic and order well in its spiritual motivations. It represents that order naturally and necessarily because it is a faculty of reason. It operates in a certain law-like pattern, habit, tendency, and that is to set ends and create steps in order to get there, and from afar tells the body, hey, move in this direction so you can get what you want. You know what I mean? So we want to make sure that the relationship between those two faculties of reason is a good one, and that practical reason can represent not only the form of law, which it naturally does anyways, but is operating in good faith and represents the spirit of the law, the purpose of it, and which can lead the body to good action, cultivating a rich spiritual disposition, which will get your spirit to heaven in the end. So in order to make sure that relationship is a good one, to make sure that we have objective sight and that we remember what we know deep down to begin with, which is the difference between good and evil, to make sure that we can interpret this world of motion and change and possibility where anything can happen in the proper way, we want to have a good hermeneutics. We want to be able to read the scriptures properly, because the scriptures provide clues as to right action and the difference between good and evil. There's a certain beatitude, a certain grace in the scriptures. God doesn't want us to fail, but he does recognize that we have free will and that might happen. That's what he gets for creating in this medium, this corrupted medium. But anyways, if we can read and understand the scriptures properly, and if we can read the book of life and understand and interpret it properly, then we are going to serve that common good, both for God and for ourselves. So to make sure that we are indoctrinated with the right interpretive lens, that so that our mind can be objective, it can be clear, so that speculative reason and practical reason are relating to each other smoothly. He sets up an educational model, which if we follow, we're going to be good to go. So when we're little children, or when we have entered the academy at whatever age, because, hell, we're all children in some way, shape, or form, we want to start our schooling with just logic. We want to study in abstraction, generalities, necessity, absolute certainty, those apodictic truths. In order to understand the law formally, and we want to practice our logic basics away in a school, and make sure we get through all the steps of learning before we go out in the world and engage in autonomous activities, so that we, use our powers for good. We want to train ourselves in a school far away from the real world, much like the characters in Harry Potter go off to Hogwarts in order to practice their spells and such on each other before they go out into the real world and accidentally cause some damage. So we're just going to start in abstraction. We're going to just start with logic, and we're going to understand what necessity means, what causality means, that is, how those premises and conclusions relate to each other. We want to understand categories correctly and study the terms all, none, some, and not all that we went over in our logic basics. And we want to know what absolute certainty is. And then we practice our logic basics away from the real world, and just start to train our minds to be able to receive this divine essence once we are ready. So the next step in our education, where we train our minds to interpret the world around us and the scripture properly, so that we don't get lost along our way, so that our spirits don't become corrupted, so that our state of affairs is conditioned by a strong disposition which will get us to heaven and allow us to flourish both here on earth and once we get to our reward. Next, we study math. And it's here where we can apply the rules of logic in a formulaic way. And again, we're just worried about numbers and abstraction and form. We're not practicing math out in the real world. We're just using our faculty of the understanding and imaginations to manipulate logical order in a practical way. So we start with strengthening our speculative reason so that it can understand truth and generalities and logic well. And with math, we start to manipulate those logical structures in equations and formulas, again, in an abstract way that's not going to hurt anybody. And we come to understand how it is absolute right and wrong come to allow us to come to right and wrong answers and balanced formulas. We understand geometry and ratio here. And so we can begin to strengthen the connection between speculative reason, which just merely understands logical truths, and practical reason, which manipulates those laws in order to get certain outcomes which we desire. So math allows us to do that. The next step in our educational journey is to study natural philosophy. And from within the tower still, we can sit in our armchairs, or rather our lawn chairs, and apply the categories of logic to the natural world so that we can identify all things and put them in their proper place with science. Much like Adam sits in the Garden of Eden and names everything, we want to, in natural philosophy, make sure that we're identifying and giving proper names to things which match their essence. Aquinas is not going to say something like, a rose by any other name is still going to smell as sweet. No, a rose is called a rose precisely because there's something about a rose which occasions that name. There's something special about it, and the very name rose speaks and reflects, mirrors the essence of the thing which it names. So we want to make sure in natural philosophy that we're naming things properly, and that from those essences we are organizing ideas in such a way that we use logic and math properly. For Aquinas, we have the material world. In the material world, we learn about through sensation. First and foremost, we have impressions. We have raw, immediate experiences of this world through our taste and our sight and our smell and whatever. And those raw experiences over time develop into ideas. They occasion ideas. And so in natural philosophy, not only are we naming things in our immediate experience correctly, we are relating those ideas about the things which we immediately experience properly. So we're making sure that we can apply these ideas to the right things to make sure we're calling roses rose is, and oohs. But we also want to make sure that our the map of ideas in our heads relate to each other properly. It's here we get into genus and species, like you see in biology, or what have you. So that's what's happening in natural philosophy. Whenever we can identify the world properly, and whenever we get our ideas about the world in order, then we can go on to the next step, which is moral philosophy. It's here that we begin to really strengthen the power of judgment, which we have. And that judgment is what allows us to have autonomy in the first place as well. So judgment is involved in all of these levels, but here we practice ultimate judgment. We want to make sure that after we've got everything in order in our heads and that we're applying logical categories to the world properly and that we can manipulate this world and its natural orders in a way which we can achieve the right ends which we desire, we want to make sure that what we're doing is good. So in each of these steps, we kind of go back to the beginning. Math will refer back to the logical truths which we gain in that realm. In natural philosophy, we want to make sure that in motion, everything's being ordered properly. And in moral philosophy, we can go back to all of these steps and evaluate whether we've done a good job or a bad job, or whether things in essence are good or bad. So in moral philosophy, we can go back to the beginning of our rational origins, which have as their basis the distinction between that which is good and that which is bad, which God doesn't even need to mention. And once we understand the truth itself and the formal shape of the law itself, how to manipulate it, how to identify things in the world through that lens and order our ideas properly based upon the world, both deductively and inductively. And once we bring all of these patterns back to the beginning and make sure that our faculties are serving the purpose of knowing good and avoiding evil, we are ready for the fifth step, which is to study metaphysics. And it's here that we gain a very real, raw, personal encounter with the divine itself. And we want to make sure that we can handle that encounter. If we are not prepared to handle an encounter with the divine, then we will crumble in the face of God. Aquinas is a Dominican. He's of the Dominican school of thought, which really champions a personal relationship with God and coming to know for yourself this divine end. But in order to handle that encounter of the infinite, in order to, without crumbling and going mad or falling into cowardice, handle that truth in full, not an abstraction, but really and rawly sense it and know it, we have to take these steps to get there, to make sure we're interpreting it right, and again, that we can encapsulate that infinity in a way that doesn't take away from infinite possibility, but allows us to digest it. So that's what metaphysics is going to involve. Coming to know for yourself the divine essence. And from that encounter with the divine essence, we can come to represent logically and objectively the realm of possibility, we can come to identify the Spirit when it does show up in the natural world, and we know how to interpret the signs of that spiritual presence of God properly, and that we can see that presence in the words of the scriptures. If you're not trained right, words are just words, and maybe they have surface level meaning for us or a practical meaning for us. But to really be able to see the spiritual presence within the scripture and to interpret any signs of spiritual presence within the world, we need this properly trained mind to ascertain that. And once we know for certain right and wrong, spiritual good versus spiritual evil, and once we have intimately integrated our practical faculty with our speculative faculty and put it to good use in natural philosophy and moral philosophy, then we can integrate the infinite into this system of sense perception, logical knowing, and applying ideas properly. Without these right steps, we're not going to be able to handle any sort of spiritual truth, and we're not going to be able to save ourselves from evil. We're not going to flourish. We're not going to have diversity in our life. And our lives will be blighted for it. So more on how this comes to manifest itself communally in the next video, because all of this is just happening on the individual level for now. Okay,